Welcome to an hour of HealthMade Radio. HealthMade is a community for natural health seekers where we educate people about common health conditions and share extensive research on the most effective natural health treatments and promote legislation that protects our health freedoms. A core concept belief is in the innate intelligence and healing power of the body, and if properly supported spiritually, emotionally, and nutritionally, it can find its way back to health. HealthMade Radio will bring you information from integrative health experts throughout the world. Check us out at healthmade.co. Health is what you make it. I'm Dr. Michael Karlfeldt, and I will be your host. Today's guest is Kathleen McAuliffe. Kathleen McAuliffe is the author most recently of the book This Is Your Brain on Parasites, How Tiny Creatures Manipulate Our Behavior and Shape Society. It's a bestseller in parasitology and microbiology that has been translated into 6 languages. Over the decades, she has written articles, many featured on covers for over a dozen national magazines, including Discover, The New York Times, The Atlantic, U.S. News and World Report, Smithsonian, and the Los Angeles Times. Earlier in her career, she was a health columnist for More magazine and a senior science editor at U.S. News and World Report and Omni magazine. In addition to writing, McAuliffe is an adjunct professor at the University of Miami, where she's currently teaching a course on the human microbiome. Kathleen, I'm really excited to chat about this subject because it's something that a lot of people try to stay away from and not recognize how important it is and the impact it has on our life. Because we all think that our brain is what controls our behavior, and in a way that's right. But we're going to chat a little bit about how it's being hijacked.
Yeah, parasites are notorious for hijacking behavior. The phenomenon is called parasitic manipulation. And basically, some parasites are masters of mind control. They found all kinds of clever ways to, either by invading the brain or changing hormone levels, affecting the immune system, but they found all kinds of ways to alter our behavior. And they do this to boost their own transmission. So it's a very common phenomenon across nature, and there are even some parasites that may affect human behavior.
Because we're thinking of parasite. Obviously, we think of most of them in kind of a human life. Obviously, we're going to talk a little bit about all different species where we can then see examples of this. But in humans, we all know how important the microbiome is, and we've talked a lot about the gut-brain connection and how important it is to have a healthy gut to support your brain function. And there's been links to the function of your gut and things like ADD, ADHD, autism, and you have a program called GAPS, which is gut and psychological syndrome, where you talk about healing your gut, healing your brain. So you have this connection between the brain and the gut. Am I right with that?
Yes, and of course, the microbes that normally dwell inside the gut, we don't think of them as parasites, and indeed, most of them don't cause any health problems for us. In fact, many of them actually improve our health. But nonetheless, I mentioned how parasites manipulate behavior. Well, they do it by churning out hormones and neurotransmitters that are identical to those of the host. Well, it turns out that a lot of the microbes that normally dwell within our gut are also churning out the very same types of compounds. They produce every neurotransmitter found in the brain. They produce every hormone made by the body, and they produce a slew of other neuroactive compounds and immune compounds that are also known to have a dramatic impact on mood and behavior. So they are most definitely important in terms of our mental health. And there are numerous diseases, you just mentioned autism, that have been linked to dysbiosis, which basically means your gut ecosystem. Those microbes have assumed a configuration that's kind of out of whack and are damaging the body. I mean, one of the first things that tends to happen when dysbiosis occurs is that the inner lining of the gut erodes, and you get what's called leaky gut syndrome, and bacteria that normally don't cause any health problems are now invading the gut wall, and they're getting into the bloodstream, and they're causing immune compounds to be produced, and these are then traveling to the brain and altering behavior. It can cause, for example, depression or heightened anxiety.
So how do we distinguish, because we're talking about the healthy gut bacteria are producing then all these different hormones and neurotransmitters that are good for us, and some people say that the gut is more of a brain than the actual brain is. So how do we distinguish between the healthy gut that produce these different neurochemicals and hormones versus then parasites and unhealthy ones that are also producing neurotransmitters and hormones? I mean, how do we know which one that's good and bad?
Oh boy, you've just asked the $60,000 question. I mean, it's something scientists are working very hard to try and figure out. Because everybody's microbiome is as distinctive as a fingerprint. I mean, my microbiome is different than your microbiome. There are certain species that most of us share in common, but there's maybe, say, 20% of the species tend to be shared in common, but the vast majority vary from individual to individual. Some people have very rare microbes, and so what constitutes, a healthy ecosystem for one person versus another, it's hard to define. There are some general characteristics, though, and that is that usually a healthy microbiome is one that's very diverse. So having a diverse range of species tends to correlate with better health. And conversely, when a few microbes tend to dominate, they're often pathogens. And making matters even more complicated. So just getting back to when one dominates, that means you have less diversity. So the pathogens are squeezing out the normal residents. So it's very hard to define, but we are seeing that certain bacteria do tend to proliferate when at the same time as certain diseases arise. So some microbes have been linked to various types of diseases, and it's also known that microbes that might be healthy if they stay put can cause disease if they get to a part of the body where they shouldn't be. So I talked about how, when the gut wall becomes eroded, bacteria can now get into cross the gut lining and, get into the bloodstream and trigger inflammation. So the same bacteria, if it stays put, is won't cause any health problems, or maybe even promotes better health. But when it gets to where it shouldn't be, it can cause a lot of problems.
And a good example of that, I would assume, would be like Candida albicans, that we naturally have in the gut, but then it can get into a very aggressive state where it drills holes through the gut wall and then enters into the bloodstream and impact the body that way. Yes.
Or, for instance, the ulcer bacteria is another example. Up until like a century ago, virtually everybody had H. pylori in their stomachs, and for the vast majority of people, it caused no problems whatsoever. But for a small percentage of people, it can burrow into the stomach lining and cause an ulcer. But when it stays in the gut and when it stays in the stomach and it remains well behaved, it actually can help you maintain a healthy weight. Because for some reason, when people have H. pylori in their stomachs, they get the signal that they've had enough to eat sooner. So, you may put down your spoon after, 3 bites of those mashed potatoes instead of 4 or 5 bites. So in that way, you consume fewer calories. Some people think the fact that we've used so many antibiotics and we've largely caused this parasite to go extinct. As a result, that may be one of many reasons that weight is increasing, has been increasing dramatically in modern times. So it's could be one factor contributing to the obesity epidemic.
That's fascinating. We're going to take a quick break. You're listening to HealthMade Radio. I'm Dr. Michael Karlfeldt. I'm here today with Kathleen McAuliffe. She is the author of the book, This Is Your Brain on Parasites, How Tiny Creatures Manipulate Our Behavior and Shape Society. We'll be right back. Welcome back to HealthMade Radio. I'm Dr. Michael Karlfeldt. I'm here with Kathleen McAuliffe. She is the author of a fascinating book, This Is Your Brain on Parasites, How Tiny Creatures Manipulate Our Behavior and Shape Society. So we have, and I've just interviewed actually Professor Schoenfeld, Yehud Schoenfeld. He's a immunologist, and one of his points, he didn't make it in the interview, but I know one of his points that he's making is that probably one of the reason autoimmunity is increasing is because we are extinguishing hermits. We are living too cleanly, and we are, because these hermits, they are there and they're suppressing our immune system, and in that way then protecting ourselves from autoimmunity. So it's just another example to show that some of these pathogens, in the right proportion, in the right place, in the right environment, they function well. And when we disrupt that, that's when we start to get issues.
Yes, it used to be thought, and still many people fear germs, and they, go to extreme lengths to try and zap them. They use antimicrobial soaps and detergents and floor cleaners and hand wipes and so forth. But a very small fraction of bacteria and other microbes actually cause disease. Most of them are harmless or actually promote health. And especially early in life, encountering a lot of germs is actually very good for training your immune system. If you live in too hygienic an environment, your body doesn't get to see enough germs, and so it doesn't. It's not as well adapted at distinguishing friendly germs from foes. And that's why your body can mistakenly attack your own body tissues, thinking that they're actually, a foreign invader causing an autoimmune disorder. And autoimmune disorders have skyrocketed in recent decades. So, and food allergies, it's really shocking, in fact, how much they've increased. And one theory is that it is related to too much hygiene, that we're not being exposed to enough germs early on. And of course, you go back a century or two, and most people lived in huts with dirt floors, and slept with their animals and so forth. So we really, as time has moved forward, we've really become increasingly, society has become very, very, hygienic to the point of being, sterile. But there's a lot of other factors that may also be affecting the microbiome. The use of antibiotics, for example, is known to decrease the diversity of your microbiome, and decreased diversity, as I mentioned before, tends to be associated with disease, makes you more vulnerable to a lot of infections. People that are less physically active by and large, and believe it or not, exercise has a big impact on your microbiome. And then we eat much less fiber than we used to. So a big problem with processed foods is that they don't. Your bacteria don't have to do that much work to digest them, so you get these huge spikes in glucose, and that can set you up for metabolic disorders that put you at higher risk of diabetes and heart disease. So there's all kinds of shifts in modern society that have adversely impacted our microbiomes.
So in essence, I mean, like you were talking about, a healthy biome is one that is diverse, and by using these kind of hand sanitizers, antibiotics, we are then getting rid of the diversity, and we still have then certain bacteria or tiny organisms and in our system. It's just that there are certain ones that proliferate faster, and it really then eliminates the diversity, and because of that our immune system is less protected, and we start to develop issues. We're less able to benefit from all the different things that the biome does in the gut and other areas of the body.
That's right, and perhaps the single most dangerous effect is on the immune system, because it's not as finely tuned. It's not as good at zeroing in on the enemy.
And one spot that in life that is really we don't recognize as much how important it is, and is right at birth. We become a society where C-section is quicker, easier, and it's the doctor can time when the delivery is going to take place. But what kind of impact does that have on the child if it's delivered through C-section versus normal birth?
Well, a lot of studies have shown that when a child is delivered by C-section, the baby's microbiome tends to look more like the first bacteria to colonize the gut tend to look more like the health professionals in the room who help deliver the baby than the mom's microbiome. And a number of studies have linked C-sections, babies born by C-section, they've shown that they're at higher risk of actually suffering from food allergies and autoimmune disorders. I just came from a microbiome conference held at the University of Miami last week, and they also reported there that babies born by C-section are at slightly higher risk of suffering from depression and anxiety, a finding that has been clearly shown in animal research, that animals delivered by C-section are more prone towards these kinds of anxiety disorders.
So with that, then we established how important a diverse microbiome is, and how important it is that we don't try to kill everything. Antibiotic, sanitation wipes, spraying chemicals all over the house to kill things. But still, then in your book, you're talking then about these parasites. So we're wanting them to obviously not have parasites to hijack us. Where do they come from? How do we protect ourselves from them? And what do they do with us?
Well, of course, it depends on the type of parasite. Let me first begin by defining a parasite, because even to scientists it means something slightly different. So when I use the term, I mean microbes like viruses and bacteria, as well as lice and mites and tapeworms and other organisms that people typically think of as parasites. And we can get them by any number of different routes. Usually exposure to animals is a leading way that we come in contact with parasites. And again, it depends on when we first encounter them. Like early in life, they may have a very different effect on our system than if we don't encounter them for the first time until later in life. So again, a window of exposure also matters. But a classic example of a parasite that I covered in my book is Toxoplasma gondii, which is a single-celled organism, a protozoan, and it can infect people, but we are accidental hosts. Normally, the parasite invades the brains of rodents, and it, by tinkering with the animal's neural circuits, it can turn their innate fear of cats into an attraction. And when I say attraction, I mean sexual attraction. I mean, the rodents are actually sexually attracted to the scent of cats. So instead of, running for cover, they actually approach only to discover they're courting a cat, and they soon end up in the animal's belly. And as it turns out, the cat gut is the only place where this parasite can replicate. So this is not just convenient for the cat, but also the parasite. So it normally goes round and round in this fashion from infected rodents back into the cat brain and so forth. And it changes a number of neurotransmitters and hormones. It does all kinds of crazy things to the body. But humans can also be exposed to the parasite. The most commonly known way is by changing a cat's litter box. So if you accidentally come in contact with a cat feces, that's one way you can be exposed. You can also just be exposed because the cat expels the parasite in its feces. You can be exposed, while gardening, or if you harvest fruits or vegetables from your garden and you don't scrub them clean, you can get exposed that way. Rodents usually pick up the parasite from the ground when they're foraging, and also livestock do, and it can become incorporated into their muscles, which is the meat that we eat. So one strange way that humans can be exposed to the parasite is by eating rare meat, like lamb or beef. And in fact, like about 20% of people in the world have this parasite in their brain. It's assumed the vast majority are suffering no adverse effects, but for a tiny percentage, nobody knows what that number would be. But for a tiny percentage, it may indeed, at least there's a lot of evidence to suggest it is causing a number of health problems, especially like ones related to mental health and reckless behavior. And if you eat a lot of rare meat, you're at perhaps greatest risk of all. Like, for instance, the French, like 20% of people around the world have the parasite in their brain, but in France it's like 50% because of their love of like very, very rare meat.
Oh, that's fascinating. We're going to take a quick break. You're listening to HealthMade Radio. I'm here with Kathleen McAuliffe. We'll be right back. Welcome back to HealthMade Radio. I'm here with Kathleen McAuliffe. She is the author of This Is Your Brain on Parasites, How Tiny Creatures Manipulate Our Behavior and Shape Society. To me, that is just fascinating how a pathogen or a parasite can exert and have that amount of intelligence and be able to control the environment in such a way for their ultimate survival. And I think that is what's so hard for people to understand, is that we just think that these are kind of dumb little pathogens, and they are not, they're not that intelligent, but it is far from the truth.
Yes, as the example of toxoplasma makes clear, the effects can be highly, highly specific. So, for example, the rodents become much more reckless when they become infected. That's thought to be related to the hike in dopamine in their brains. And infected people several studies have shown, are more at heightened risk of being in car crashes where they're the one at fault. So a number of researchers have speculated that you're seeing, again, changes perhaps in dopamine levels and reckless behavior. In humans, it's also been linked to schizophrenia. Like there have been actually there was an overview study of 38 different studies in the literature on schizophrenia, and people with schizophrenia are 2 to 3 times more likely to have antibodies against this cat parasite than people who don't have schizophrenia.
That's amazing. And what are some of the other examples of parasites? I know we mentioned the toxoplasma as some other parasites that be manipulating behaviors.
Well, some of my favorite are actually examples from other parts of nature. One in particular is a parasitic barnacle called Saculina. Suspend any preconceived notions you have about barnacles. This one does not have a shell or attach itself to, the sides of rocks or piers or seaweed. It has this free-living stage when it kind of frolics about in the sea until, following the scent of a crab, it alights on its surface and injects just a clump of its cells, a small clump of cells, into the crab. And this clump of cells then grows into this dense morass of fibers that wrap around the crab's brain and all of its organs, and eventually it actually neuters the crab. And where a female crab would grow a brood pouch, the barnacle grows, to harbor its young. The barnacle pushes out and grows a brood pouch of its own. And from this point onwards, the crab lives solely to nourish the parasite and protect its young. It outwardly appears to be like any normal crab. If you see it on the shore, it's, munching mollusks and do what crabs normally do. But what you're looking at is actually a barnacle masquerading as a crab. And when the parasites young are ready to be born, the crab will then go out into deep water and start sort of bobbing up and down and dispersing the parasite's young into the water, all the while kind of stirring the water with its claws to send them on their way, so that they can parasitize the minds and bodies of more crabs. And these parasitic manipulators are very common in nature, and this one is a classic example. I'd never heard of it before I did the book, but it turns out that 50% of crabs in Hawaii are what I call robo-crabs. These really, a barnacle is piloting these crabs.
It's like body snatched.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It's a very good example of body snatching, yes. And so that's 50% of crabs in Hawaii are robo-crabs, and 75% of crabs in the Chesapeake Bay are robo-crabs. And in some parts of the Mediterranean, if a crab lives long enough, 100% become infected.
So what happens if a human eats that crab? Do we get infected by it?
I asked that question because I really did not like the idea of blue crab being served up on my plate that was really in reality a parasite.
Exactly.
But apparently I was told that fishermen look for the brood pouch. It's a bright yellow sort of bladder-shaped organ on the crabs, and the crabs also no longer shed their shells and regrow a new shell, and so the outside of their shells become very mangy looking, like seaweed and stuff clinging to them. So the fishermen just automatically toss those crabs aside. So they have ways of sifting through them very quickly.
To pinpoint. Okay, well that I feel better. I'm just nervous about the one that they missed. that's my concern.
Yeah, I know. It made me a little bit nervous too.
Yeah,
but
exactly.
Yeah, there is a type of parasitic barnacle in Portugal. I've forgotten what it's called. It starts with a P, but at any rate, it's considered a delicacy, and people love it. So maybe it wouldn't be so bad if you ate it. For all we know, it might be delicious.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I just don't want to...
Unappetizing to think about, but there's a lot of things we eat that are very appetizing sounding.
Yeah, I just don't want to find myself in the middle of the ocean, kind of having stirring my arms to make sure that I spray out the eggs properly. Yeah, that's... So what are some examples in humans? I mean, does this also take place in humans? How our brain are impacted, how our behavior, nervous system impacted by parasites?
Well, of course, the classic example is rabies. And again, we're unintended, you're an accidental host, but and rabies, by the way, is still epidemic in many parts of the world, like, for example, in India and other parts of Southeast Asia and some parts of Africa. If you ever get bitten by a wild dog, be sure to get a rabies shot immediately. It's actually very interesting parasitic manipulator, because when a dog bites you, the virus, a rabid dog, rather, a rabid animal bites you, the virus doesn't enter the bloodstream the way almost all other viruses do, or these pathogenic viruses. Instead, it moves at a sort of a plodding pace, snail-like pace, up along nerve fibers. It follows these nerve tracks up into the brain. So it can take, a few weeks before people show signs of disease. And of course, it once it gets into the brain, it invades a part of the brain that controls aggression, hunger, sex, sort of fundamental drives. In humans, the symptoms are in some ways mirror what you see in animals. So, people can fly into a rage and have hallucinations, they foam at the mouth. But there's other ways in which it has sort of a unique impact. One is that it triggers hydrophobia. That's unique to humans. Nobody knows why. Hydrophobia is a fear of water. So, like, just hearing water splashing around in a basin, or seeing water, running water, can cause a sort of like gagging reflex. One of the early signs of rabies is hydrophobia, and a unusual but well documented symptom of rabies in people is hypersexuality. To suddenly want sex all the time, and in France, like in the 18th century, they called it la rage amoureuse, amorous rage, or le fureur utérine, which is, I guess, a furious uterus. But both men and women have been known to experience really heightened a desire for sex when they are in early stages of rabies. And it's thought that might even be the basis for vampire and werewolf legends, actually, because they trace back to the 18th century in Eastern Europe. And according to folklore, a vampire is a person who including someone deceased, who rises at night and assumes the form of a dog, and then rapes or ravages their neighbors. And then in subsequent retelling of this myth, the person would assume the form of a bat, another vector for rabies, and then, of course, as we all know, vampires are hypersexual. They don't go around sucking the blood of shriveled up old ladies. They love, beautiful young maidens. And then there's other things about the legend, like, for example, according to folklore, if you wanted to, kill a vampire, what you had to do to keep them in their grave was to pour water around the grave, and that's again probably related to hydrophobia.
That's fascinating.
And the average lifespan of a vampire is supposed to be 40 days, which is about the average time a person will live after being bit by a rabid animal.
Oh,
There's
really?
all kinds of curious parallels.
That's fascinating. Are there some common? So you have the rabies, and obviously that is kind of a very classical example, and it's very distinct. Are just like the crabs? I mean, you really can't recognize that crab is hijacked. I mean, are there scenarios where we are in some way hijacked without knowing? We seem normal, everything seems okay, but things are just a little bit driven in the direction of the benefit of whatever pathogen or parasite.
Well, one intriguing study suggests that it's possible that the flu virus may be able to increase sociability. It's a very small study, and I would definitely like to see it replicated, but it is intriguing. Basically, what the researchers discovered when they searched the literature is that the flu virus is most contagious the first 2 or 3 days after a person's been exposed, and it's before they show any symptoms. So it's at the symptomless phase, just prior to developing a runny nose and cough, that people are shedding the most viruses. And they got the idea that they thought, a flu vaccine basically contains all the same, like components, like as the wild type virus, except that it's had its DNA removed, so it can't cause disease. But to the immune system, it's recognized in the same way, which is why it triggers an immune reaction and protection. So they thought, hey, maybe if we study people right after they've gotten a flu vaccine, we might see a change in their behavior. And their thinking was, if you get a flu vaccine, in the first few days afterwards, maybe you'll become much more sociable, so you can spread the virus. That would be in the virus's interest. So they did exactly that study. I mean, it only had about 40 people, but they got a really dramatic result. I mean, people were twice as sociable right after getting a flu vaccine than those who hadn't gotten the vaccine. Actually they compared them to the same person before and after vaccine. And what surprised them is that some people who were really kind of lived very reclusive, hermit-like lives, suddenly after being vaccinated, wanted to go out and party or go to, a bar or have friends over, whatever. So it's a study that they are hoping to now follow with a much more larger and more rigorous trial.
That's fascinating. So the key to being an introvert is to get a flu vaccine. Is that?
I guess so.
Okay. And what does that's really interesting with the flu vaccine. What are some of the things that these different pathogens? I mean, obviously we talked a little bit about some parasites, and you have the flu bug, and what are some of the things that they can manipulate? We talked a little bit about the immune system, neurotransmitters. I mean, are there some? How did we find out that they can create these kind of changes and impact the body in these different ways?
Well, in most cases, of course, the parasitic manipulators that are best understood are ones that infect humans. Obviously, because we can do experiments on animals that we would never dream of doing on humans, but they certainly get you thinking about what might be going on in people. I mean, I'll just give you another example of a manipulation in nature that I found quite intriguing, and it's with this fish, killifish. They're normally very cautious creatures. By the way, they're very, very abundant. They're sort of, definitely perhaps one of the most abundant types of fish found in like freshwater estuaries in Southern California. Anyway, they're normally, they're about the size of, say, my index finger. They're not very big fish. And when they become infected with this flatworm, it follows nerve tracts to their brain, and the parasite produces chemicals that act on the same nerve circuits as Prozac. So infected fish are kind of like, fish on Prozac. I mean, they're very, very low anxiety, and it turns out if you're a fish, that's not a good thing. So the infected fish will rise to the surface, and they'll flip over on their sides, exposing their white underbelly, and all but wave their fins at shorebirds circling overhead, which promptly swoop down and pull them out of the sea.
Yeah, it may not be a bright idea.
No, it's definitely not. And then of course the fish is where the parasite it replicates in the fish gut, and then the fish. And the bird droppings then repopulate the oceans with more of this parasitic flatworm. So in this way, the parasite goes round and round. And if we could actually, and you're walking along the shoreline, if you could actually see the parasite, it would be like watching this massive conveyor belt moving, like an escalator, moving the parasite from the sea up into the air and then back down again into the sea, round and round.
That's incredible. That's fascinating. And I mean, like you're saying, we're seeing these examples in animals, and we can just assume that a lot of these things are then taking place within ourselves when because we are complex organisms, and we have a very complex microbiome, and we're, obviously we're affected by a lot of different parasites and pathogens, and we can just assume that is taking place within us in some fashion.
Well, as I say, we know certainly in the microbiome that organisms are altering behavior. And I mean, the best example of that is what are called germ-free animals. These are basically rodents that are raised under completely sterile conditions so that they have no microbiome at all. And, these animals, these sterile animals, are positively bizarre. Like a normal rodent, one with a normal complement of microbes, is a very inquisitive creature. It's a quick learner, remembers how to run mazes. It's fearful of predators. But these germ-free animals, these sterile animals, are just bizarre by comparison. They are slow to learn, quick to forget. And they are stunningly devoid of fear. So they think nothing of roaming into wide open or brightly lit spaces that scream danger to a normal rodent, and they don't even experience distress when separated from their mothers, whose nurturance and protection is critical for their survival. But if you then repopulate these animals with the normal microbiome while they're still young, their behavior completely normalizes.
So how I mean that's fascinating. You can actually see then how because you have humans. If you look like an autistic child, for instance, and you're seeing how they may not have that connection and kind of have this little bit more bizarre behavior. So it just shows then that the microbiome in itself can then have the impact on how we relate, how we connect with our parents, and also how we understand our environment. So without the microbiome, we really have no understanding on how to survive within the environment.
Yes, the microbiome has been shown to have a particularly big impact on social behavior. So it's not so surprising that it has been linked to autism. And a large percentage of kids who suffer from autism also have gut problems. Like they suffer from, irritable bowel disease or high number of food allergies, this kind of thing. Autism is obviously a multifactorial disease with many different causes, but the fact that I believe more than 50%, it might even be as high as 80% of kids with autism have these gut disorders. And there have been some very provocative studies on rodents. They're using rodent models for autism. I don't know how much they actually mirror the human disease, but they've actually been able to find a specific microbe, and for that matter, a specific chemical produced by the microbe that triggers autism-like behavior in the animals. And in the absence of any microbiome, the animals don't develop autism.
That's incredible. And what I'm curious about, though, when you're going back again to these sterile rodents, because we were talking about antibiotics, and then also how we want everything clean, we want a sterile environment, we spray everything to kill everything, and the same then with our food, we use all these pesticides, creating then a very sterile or not very diverse biome. So it would then reason to say then by doing that, our ability to really understand how to survive and function in our environment is then completely altered.
Yes, I would definitely discourage people from using antimicrobial products kind of willy-nilly. I don't buy soaps with or deodorants or shampoos or anything with antimicrobial compounds in them. And there's no evidence that ordinary soap isn't just as effective in every way.
No.
So and like ordinary soap will zaps germs in a completely different way that doesn't create antibiotic resistance or these other problems with the microbiome. And also eating a healthy, a diet that's really rich in fruits and vegetables and, basically a very high fiber diet is also seems to be another way to enhance health. And obviously antibiotics, if you have a serious infection, they are lifesavers, and I would never tell people, not to take an antibiotic if they had a serious infection. But I think there's no question that a lot of people, go to see a doctor and they almost demand an antibiotic, even if the doctor says, look, I really think you have a viral infection. And hopefully people will think twice now about, wanting an antibiotic and only using it when it's really necessary. Because every time you use an antibiotic, you, in theory, are, could be, usually the microbiome does reconstitute, but usually you lose some species along the way. So if you use antibiotics repeatedly, you're going to, over time, really be depleting your microbiome.
And that would then, in turn, alter how you think, your immune system, your behavior, because it's so driven by the gut bacteria. Yes,
although I would emphasize that it's particularly early in life that the microbiome tends to be quite resilient to, insult, whether it be antibiotics or bad diet or whatever. But early in life, if things get dysbiosis early in life, when that whole ecosystem gets out of whack early in life, it can have really far-reaching ramifications. That's where, it can perhaps, lead to lifelong mood disorders or make you more vulnerable to obesity or any number of other complicating factors. Chronic diseases is what I was trying to say.
Yeah. One thing, because I know we got to wrap it up here, but I'm curious about one thing, and that is, say, sexual attraction between individuals. Does their microbiome play a role in that? Probably,
because you have a lot of different bacteria that inhabit the armpits, which produce a lot of pheromones, and there's a fair amount of research that suggests that humans actually are very sensitive to smell. And in fact, there's one study that shows it was done with women, and if they said if a man smelled wrong, it didn't matter how accomplished he was, what he looked like, they just were not interested in dating him. So we certainly know that the bacteria that live on the skin have a lot to do with with how you smell.
Well, it's a really fascinating discussion and opening up the understanding of how these parasites, how they really kind of hijack our system in a way. I mean, it's been said that we are 10% ourselves and 90% other living organisms, and to understand then that our choices, what we eat, how we behave, all of these things are directly connected to what kind of bacteria, what kind of other agents, other living organisms that we have within us, rather than just our own thinking. It's a really fascinating and sometimes a little scary thought to have.
I think it's actually all quite wonderful, but as you said, it can be a little scary contemplating it too.
Exactly. Well, I truly, your book is incredible, and it's really, I think it's really fascinating. So all your listeners out there, the book is "This Is Your Brain on Parasites: How Tiny Creatures Manipulate Our Behavior and Shape Society." Thank you so much, Kathleen, for being on the show today. I appreciate it.
My pleasure.
That is it for today. You're listening to HealthMade Radio. You can check us out at healthmade.co. Health is what you make it.